let me in the last few minutes tell you about what happens when you try to bring this up with the federal government. And let me just finish. Aren't there supposed to be laws and rules about this? In July of 2007, at Feinstein's meeting, I brought up the first case. I wrote something out. There was the case for scientific misconduct. I handed it to the Interior Solicitor, Molly Ross, and to the Regional Director of the Park Service, John Jarvis. I gave them a very logical, scientifically based case for scientific misconduct. I never got a response back, ever. Okay, several months later, the Inspector General asked me to give them a case. I did it. What happened to that case I gave them? They said, look, we don't have any scientists on staff. We're not equipped to deal with scientific misconduct. We can't analyze the science. The Inspector General report, when it came out, said we did not, however, analyze the science involved because they're not funded. They don't have any scientists. I said, why don't you use the National Academy? Well, we've never done that. We're not funded to do that. Okay. December 18th, I went to Mary Bomar, who I sat across the table from a few months earlier, and I gave her a 72-page case for scientific misconduct. The Inspector General told me to do that under their instructions. I gave it to the National Park Service. They never responded. I also gave it to the National Academy. They asked for it. They said, look, we're prepared to look at the science, but we are not prepared to make any determination about misconduct. I'm not blaming them. I'm just saying I want you to understand what happens if you take a complaint to the federal government. The Academy said, we'll look at the science, and they agreed that it was all misrepresented, and they've never seen the photographs, by the way. You've seen something they never have. They agreed that it was misrepresented. They wouldn't deal with misconduct. So how about our federal government? Well, let's see. Eventually, I gave a case to the National Academy that they set up to Salazar right after Obama became president, and he appointed Ken Salazar as the director of the National Park Service, the Secretary of Interior. My 28-page case was sent up to Salazar from the Academy. He never responded. No one in his administration ever responded. How did I find out a year later they tried to blunt that? The anonymous briefing statement. The document I just showed you that had the photograph of the two kayaks or canoes, which supposedly was showing that I was wrong about saying the guys don't work on Sundays, that was the document that was given to the Interior. I never saw it. The National Research Council never saw it. Nothing was ever investigated. This is our federal government at work. Finally, I eventually, when I saw that one of the people involved in this case, John Jarvis, was the Western Regional Director, he was very involved in all of this, and he was about, so the rumor was, to be nominated as the director of the National Park Service. I don't know about you, but I thought, I don't think someone should be director of the National Park Service if there's a several-year-old case of misconduct against him and the superintendent of his park that no one has ever considered. I've written all these documents, no one has ever considered them. So I sent to Salazar. I never heard back. I then got in contact with John Holdren. We have some mutual friends in common, and I talked to the president's science advisor. He and I have become good friends. And I talked to him about this. He looked at the documents. I'll say he's one of the few scientists who has looked, and he agreed. He said, this looks pretty bad. This looks like misconduct to me. This should be studied properly. Even the president's science advisor in the White House couldn't get this looked at. Interior was determined to get Jarvis's nomination through, and they were not going to let the issue of scientific integrity get in the way. Our federal government at work. I'm not going to take you through all the details here, but it was a very interesting, sordid history. I finally took it back to the Inspector General, and I took it back to John Dupuy, and within a week, they decided that my allegation was wrong so that the nomination could take place. That was political pressure. A few weeks later, I called up John Dupuy on the phone. He and I have become good colleagues. I know you're all reading. I'm happy to give you the slides on this stuff. And here's what my conversation with John Dupuy a few weeks later. I said, John, how did you in 6 working days decide my allegation was wrong? He said, I said, what? I said, there were 30 allegations of scientific misconduct. He said, Corey, I told you a year ago, we don't have any scientists. I said, well, what did you look at then? He said, we looked at a single procedural issue. One of the documents you said that was false, he said, all we looked at is we determined that we couldn't prove that John Jarvis was involved in that document. I said, but the case I gave you had 30 points about scientific misconduct. He said, we don't have any scientists. We couldn't look at it. I said, so in the Senate hearing, when it was read, and let me go back on the slide, talk about, getting your name. When Senator Bingham Hingeman, I should say, opened the hearing by saying that these charges were wrong. I said, you mean you never looked at the charges in the IG's office? He said, no, we looked at one procedural issue. We couldn't prove Jarvis was involved in that document. I said, how about my 29 other points of scientific misconduct of all this stuff? He said, well, we have no scientists. We can't do it. So I asked Dupuy, I said, who should investigate this then? He said, well, it's not the National Park Service, not Department of Interior, not the Inspector General, not the Academy, not the Marine Mammal Commission. I said, who? And he said, well, have you ever talked to the White House? And I said, yeah, I've been in touch with the President's Science Advisor. He said, well, the problem is, he said, Interior needs a scientific integrity policy. Now you understand the slide I showed you early on. What came out this April? Interior needs a scientific integrity policy, where one of the 3 examples in that is the one I've been telling you about. So where do we stand today? Well, we stand that now they claim they're going to have a policy, but for 3.5 years, there has been no policy. These papers have gone in. And let me just contrast that with what happens in academia. This is something many of you have read about in the last couple of months. We talked about it earlier today. Dr. Hauser from Harvard, who was someone blew the whistle on him and said that some of his papers didn't look right. And let's just contrast what happens at one of our academic institutions versus what happens in the federal government. And I've made up a table here in the last slide. At Harvard, when someone brought forward the case of scientific misconduct, there was proper governance in place. There was a faculty-based process. Faculty panel found the professor guilty of misconduct. The dean made a very clear public statement of the findings. What happened with this case of the National Park Service? A member of the National Academy of Sciences who was asked by the county supervisors to look at this. I've written documents, so I'm not writing these documents anymore. I've written documents, I've given them to the Park Service, to Interior. The IG says they're not equipped to adjudicate science. The Academy and the Marine Mammal Commission say they're not authorized to do so. Interior has simply participated in the cover-up. That's how our government took this case. Scientific papers. At Harvard, the published papers have been retracted, corrected. The journals have gotten very involved. What's happened with the Park Service? The papers are still standing. They won't retract them. In fact, those papers are being disseminated. The ones that have the false science are being used by new environmental impact studies to go after this guy, even though they're based on false disturbances. Well, how about disciplinary action? Well, at Harvard, the professor is put on administrative leave pending further investigation. How about in the Park Service? I've tried not to name names today, because to me this isn't about individuals, this is about a culture. This is about a culture in the National Park Service and Interior that's broken and doesn't work. It's not about individuals. But I'll tell you, every one of the individuals involved has been promoted. One of them is now director of the National Park Service. Another one has been promoted to be head of Yosemite, the crown jewel in the Park Service, and other ones have gotten higher level science positions. Everyone got promoted while this was going on. And finally, public statements. The professor at Harvard has admitted his mistakes, apologized to the community. They're more strident and defiant as ever. At the National Park Service, when they talk to the press, they refuse to admit any mistakes, and they do character assassinations and ad hominem attacks on the person who's brought it forward. What's the lesson I've learned? I've learned that back in December of 2000, the Clinton administration did the right thing when they said that we needed to have a scientific integrity policy for our federal government. The National Academy did the right thing 8 years earlier when they said there should be one. And we still have a case almost 2 years into the Obama administration where we still have agencies, no matter how well-meaning he is, or John Holdren, or some of the other top scientists in his administration, we still have a case where it's agency by agency, and we have agencies where we have a culture where predetermined policy agendas are driving science. And until we clean up that culture, until we do something that actually makes it so scientists report the real data and don't feel pressured from the people above, we're going to wind up with ClimateGate and everything else going on and on. As it stands right now, is I mean, these scientists, for all I know, are perfectly fine people. I'm not criticizing them. I think the culture, it starts at the top. It starts with the politicians who come up with predetermined agendas of what they want. Whether that oyster farm should be there or not, I actually don't care, and that's not what I'm here to tell you about today. It's just rather that some politicians made a decision, and the scientists basically either came up with data or claims that confirmed those decisions. And what we now know today, it's no longer a he said, she said. 3.5 years of photographs show that they haven't been telling the truth. And I don't mince words when I say that. They haven't been telling the truth, and they've never disclosed the cameras, and now we know why. So I'm glad to answer questions on any of this, particular as it pertains to the government, the policy, and how we're going to deal with scientific integrity in our federal government. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Corey.
Can I take any questions? Or
Yes, you can. And I'm going to have a couple of comments at the end. So we have a question over here. Please, would you?
Fire away. Yeah.
Why does the National Park Service want to get rid of this oyster?
Yeah, the question was, why does the National Park Service want to get rid of the oyster farm? I want to try to answer that briefly, because that you can say, why do people do this? What is the agenda? It has to do with, are you going to keep agriculture in a national seashore or not? And it has to do with the meaning of wilderness. They want to turn part of a body of water into wilderness. I mean, many of us here are biologists, we're all scientists. Wilderness is a great thing. We could talk privately tonight about what's the meaning of a small postage stamp bit of wilderness when you have close to 3 million visitors a year. Already the body of water that's called wilderness is very trammeled and the seals are getting chased away. But it's to be able to say they've got a piece that's wilderness. That's how they've gotten the Sierra Club and all these other environmental groups. They've dangled the word wilderness in front of them. And the sad thing is, and I say this as an environmentalist, the sad thing when I see so-called environmental groups suddenly getting behind the ends justify the means, where they're willing to accept sloppy, or in this case misused and abused science to simply get what they want, which is the label of wilderness going on something. That's a slippery slope when the ends justify the means. But that's what they're looking for, is to declare Drake Sestero wilderness. That's a separate topic. That's the policy debate they'd like to have. What I've always said is, actually, my interest isn't that. My interest is, let's make sure we're at least presenting the right science to drive that policy debate. Other questions?
Other questions or comments? Well, I have.
Bruce looks like he's about to ask me one.
Well, my understanding of what you think happened is basically there's a clear sense that the scientists should find some disturbances from Washington or from somebody putting pressure on the scientists to get them data that would allow them to make decisions.
Well, the superintendent of that park told the county supervisor who called me up that Saturday morning to ask me to get involved. He was told a few weeks earlier that they already had overwhelming data. He's testified on that under oath, that they had overwhelming data of harm to the harbor seals, when what the record shows is up to that point there was not a single bit of data. He and Feinstein set a hearing for about a month later. So suddenly, my interpretation is that we had to manufacture data to come up with some disturbances. All the disturbances, the main ones, happened in the 12 days before the hearing. That was the Sunday disturbance, that was the boat's broken disturbance, that's also the boat goes by and none of the seals flush in the water disturbance. Those are the disturbances that took place in the 12 days before the hearing.
You had to get data to support your statement.
Predetermined statement, you had to get the data to support it. That's the best I can tell you.